She trusted her husband and assistant blindly, but one fall was enough for Charlotte Mason to uncover the macabre plan that nearly killed her. Betrayed, abandoned, and on the brink of despair, she chose to fight. What no one expected was for this art curator to rise from the ashes, exposing her enemies and turning her pain into the greatest victory of her life. Are you ready to explore the darkest and brightest sides of this story of resilience? Charlotte Mason was one of those people who made everything look easy. The art curator who had transformed a small gallery in downtown New York into a cultural empire, the Aurora Mason Gallery, seemed to be living the dream. Her days were filled with cocktails, exhibitions, and conversations about the soul behind each brushstroke. Yet behind the silk curtains and her flawless smile, something didn't quite fit. Jake, her husband, a respected attorney, had a way of being both present and distant at the same time. And Charlotte felt it, even though she tried to ignore it. On good days, Jake was charming, with a natural talent for captivating anyone in conversation. But on bad days, and they came more often than Charlotte cared to admit, he exuded something close to disdain. It was in the little things. A pause that lasted too long before he replied, a smile that never reached his eyes, a joke that carried a tone that felt off when directed at her. Charlotte found herself lost in thought, questioning if the problem was her or if this silent neglect was a reflection of something much larger. At the gallery, however, Charlotte was invincible. There, she found a sense of belonging her personal life didn't seem to offer. Surrounded by vibrant colors, unique textures, and the sounds of enthusiastic young artists, Charlotte felt at home. Yet even there, the fear that something could crumble lingered. The inner voice she had ignored so many times seemed to grow louder, whispering that the cracks were spreading. And then there was Naomi. Naomi, the efficient assistant who seemed to have answers before Charlotte even formulated the questions. Everyone praised Naomi, and Charlotte did too, though with a certain unease she couldn't quite explain. There was something about the way Naomi moved through the gallery, too self-assured, too confident, that unsettled Charlotte. But as always, she pushed the feeling aside. Paranoia, she told herself, watching Naomi and Jake exchange furtive glances that seemed to last just a moment too long. Charlotte had built that world with her own hands. Every piece in the gallery, every alliance she had forged over the years, was the result of her tireless dedication. Yet loneliness began to whisper in her ears. It was a peculiar kind of loneliness, the kind that creeps in when you're surrounded by people but still feel utterly alone. She noticed it, but avoided facing it head-on. After all, admitting the emptiness was to name the fear that everything might collapse. At home, life followed an almost choreographed rhythm. Silent dinners, occasional conversations about work, and an ocean of unspoken things hanging in the air. Jake had a particular talent for deflecting any deep conversation, making Charlotte feel alone even when he was right there. But she wasn't the type to give up easily. Denying her own feelings seemed easier than confronting what they might mean. What Charlotte didn't know was that the tension she felt wasn't imagined. While she immersed herself in the nuances of human emotion portrayed in the artwork she loved, the real drama was unfolding. And in this drama, she wasn't the author but the target. Jake and Naomi weren't just partners in administrative matters. There was something much darker at play. Deep down, Charlotte wanted to believe her intuition was wrong. The idea that the emotional neglect she felt could be intentional was too devastating to accept. Yet the pieces were there, waiting to be connected. One day, she would piece them together. But until then, Charlotte clung to her routine, ignoring the signs and immersing herself in the one thing that seemed to give her life meaning: art. The gallery was her fortress but also her blind spot. While Charlotte devoted herself to preserving the beauty and stories behind each piece, another narrative was being written, one that threatened to steal everything she had built. And when that story emerged, there would be no ignoring it. Something was about to happen, and Charlotte wasn't prepared. It was supposed to be a perfect night. The opening of yet another breathtaking exhibition at the Aurora Mason Gallery had drawn journalists, collectors, and young artists hungry for inspiration. Charlotte, as always, was impeccable, a flowing blue silk dress and a smile that seemed genuine. But what she didn't know was that this would be the last night she lived her routine as she knew it. It all began with a push. Literally. As she descended the iconic marble staircase of the gallery, something, or someone, pushed her. There was no time to scream, no time to react. Her body tumbled, the marble steps seemed endless, and the impact on the floor echoed throughout the gallery. People ran, screams filled the air. Charlotte lost consciousness, plunging into a void that seemed infinite. The art around her bore silent witness to its creator's fall. Waking up in the hospital was a blur. Sounds were muffled, the nurses' faces a mix of light and shadow. Charlotte didn't know how much time had passed, but soon she realized she was alive. And that seemed like a cruel irony when she heard the first words that broke the silence. His voice was unmistakable, but what he said was a nightmare. "She's not dead yet," she heard, irritation lacing his tone. "Naomi, if this doesn't work, we need another plan." Charlotte didn't move. She couldn't. Not because she was physically unable, but because fear had frozen her. Her husband, the man she had shared her life and dreams with, was plotting her death. And Naomi, her trusted assistant, was his accomplice. Every word she overheard seemed to tear pieces of her soul. They spoke of forged insurance policies, falsified contracts, and their urgency to claim Charlotte's inheritance. At that moment, caught between terror and despair, Charlotte made a decision. She would pretend to be unconscious. If they thought she was defenseless, she would use it to her advantage. She needed time to think, to process what she had just discovered. And she needed a plan. But how could someone who could barely get out of bed fight two enemies who had already shown they were willing to go to any lengths? As silence filled the room, Charlotte began organizing her thoughts. She was in danger, that was clear. But the emotional abandonment she had felt for years had morphed into something far darker. And now, as Jake and Naomi spoke as if she were invisible, Charlotte made a promise to herself. She wouldn't be a passive victim. She had to survive. She had to fight. But how? Every word uttered by Jake and Naomi was a cruel reminder that she was alone. The person who should have protected her was, in fact, the enemy. And the assistant she had almost considered a friend was a betrayer. Charlotte felt a mix of emotions: sadness, anger, helplessness. But above all, she felt a small spark of determination beginning to form. This wouldn't be the end. It couldn't be. The following days were filled with silence and observation. Jake and Naomi visited the hospital, their voices dripping with false concern as they performed for the nurses. Charlotte listened to every word, mentally recording details that might prove useful later. The more she heard, the clearer it became that her life was hanging by a thread. But if it were up to her, she would be the one to cut theirs. On the outside, Charlotte appeared to be a fragile patient, battling the effects of her fall. On the inside, she was beginning to draft the lines of a plan that would change everything. She didn't know how or when, but she knew she would reclaim her life, or at least what was left of it. The question haunting her now was, who would help her along the way? Because no matter how determined she was, Charlotte knew she couldn't do it alone. The days dragged on like an endless winter. Still confined to that hospital bed, Charlotte felt the crushing weight of fear and betrayal. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the marble staircase, heard the sound of the impact, and felt the abandonment that surrounded her. How could she fight enemies who had already taken so much from her? Jake was calculated and cold, Naomi ruthless. The thought of confronting them seemed absurd, almost suicidal. She thought about giving up, more often than she cared to admit. A small part of her believed it might be easier to let things run their course. After all, what would be left for her even if she managed to survive? Emotions swirled in her mind: sadness, anger, self-pity. It wasn't just her body that was fractured, her soul was too. Jake and Naomi had taken not just her trust but also her sense of safety in the world. Each day, Charlotte found herself sinking deeper into her dark thoughts. Her entire life felt like a house of cards, collapsing at the slightest touch. The gallery, which had always been her refuge, now seemed distant, almost unattainable. It would be easier to run, disappear. Let Jake and Naomi have what they wanted and start over somewhere where no one knew her. But even that felt impossible. How could she begin anew without hope? The loneliness in the hospital was deafening. Even surrounded by attentive nurses and routine visits from doctors, Charlotte felt invisible. They couldn't see the internal battle she was fighting. And she wouldn't let them. How could she explain the weight of what she had discovered? Even if she did, who would believe her? Jake was charismatic, a well-known lawyer, someone who knew how to manipulate with ease. There was one night in particular when Charlotte nearly gave up entirely. The hospital lights were dim, and the sound of the machines was the only thing filling the room's emptiness. A silent tear rolled down her face as she whispered to herself, "Maybe this is the end." The despair felt like an infinite ocean, and she was tired of swimming against the current. Why fight when everything pointed to defeat? But something stopped her from surrendering completely. It was a simple, almost insignificant thought. Her gallery. Charlotte remembered how it all began, all the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the risky bets. That gallery wasn't just a physical space, it was a piece of her essence. And the idea of Jake and Naomi dismantling it, her life, her dreams, ignited a spark, however small. Even so, doubt lingered. Charlotte knew she would need strength, and that was something that seemed to slip further from her grasp each day. Recovering physically and emotionally felt like an impossible mountain to climb. And then there was the fear. What would happen if she failed? What would happen if Jake realized she knew everything? The line between her desire to fight and her temptation to give up was razor thin. Charlotte clung to that spark but didn't know how to turn it into a flame. She needed something, or someone, to help her see beyond her pain. The desire for justice was there, buried beneath layers of exhaustion and disillusionment. And though she didn't know it yet, her answer was closer than she imagined. Because sometimes, the universe finds unexpected ways to reignite what we believe is lost. That morning, as the sun peeked through the hospital windows, Charlotte met Oliver Reed. He didn't seem like someone who would change her life, just a young paramedic with bright eyes and a smile that insisted on surfacing even on the toughest days. Oliver frequently passed by Charlotte's room, usually checking equipment or offering words of encouragement that, to her, sounded irritatingly optimistic. But something about his carefree demeanor began to chip away at the shield Charlotte had built around herself. It was during a casual conversation that Oliver offhandedly mentioned he was also an artist. Charlotte raised an eyebrow, skeptical but curious. He shared his love for painting and how he used art to overcome past traumas, a troubled childhood, an absent father, a series of abandonments he chose to transform into color rather than bitterness. Despite herself, Charlotte felt something she hadn't experienced in days: connection. Perhaps because, deep down, they weren't so different. "Did you know your gallery was one of the first to give space to young artists?" Oliver asked as he adjusted Charlotte's sheets. She froze. She didn't know if that was a compliment or a cruel reminder of what she was about to lose. But Oliver continued, unaware of her discomfort. "Art has this power, you know? To transform. It saved my life, in a way." His words, so simple and sincere, seemed to reach a part of her that Charlotte had been trying to ignore. That night, Charlotte couldn't sleep. Oliver's words echoed in her mind. He spoke of overcoming challenges with a lightness that felt unattainable to her, yet it stirred something deep inside. Maybe she wasn't as alone as she thought. Maybe there was room to rebuild, to fight. But how? Oliver seemed to see something in her that she couldn't see in herself, and that both unsettled and intrigued her. The next day, Oliver appeared with a cup of coffee in hand. "Smuggled in," he said, "because the hospital had the worst coffee in the world." Charlotte smiled, a rare gesture lately. They talked more, this time about the gallery. Oliver asked questions that seemed to have an unspoken purpose, to remind her of what she had built, of the impact her gallery had on the world. He didn't know about Jake and Naomi, of course, but somehow his words brought comfort. "You think this is the end, but it's not," Oliver said suddenly, his voice serious. Charlotte looked up, confused. "You're stronger than you think, you know that? People like you don't give up. They fall, but they get back up." There was something about his sincerity that struck a chord. Perhaps because he wasn't there to gain anything. He wasn't like Jake or Naomi. He seemed genuine. And Charlotte, without realizing it, began to cling to that thread of hope. Oliver's visits became a bright spot in Charlotte's days. He brought stories, jokes, even small canvases with sketches he made during his breaks. Slowly, Charlotte began to share as well, her memories, her fears. She didn't have the courage to tell the whole truth yet, but in that safe space, she started to feel less crushed by the weight of everything. Oliver wasn't just a paramedic or an aspiring artist. He was becoming an ally. It was during one of those conversations that Charlotte realized she had to act. Oliver, with his fearless optimism, had reignited something within her. The spark that once felt so distant was beginning to grow into a flame. She didn't know exactly how, but she knew he was part of the answer. And so, with a still hesitant heart, Charlotte decided to take the first step, one into the unknown. In the dead of night, when the hospital seemed to breathe in silence, Charlotte found herself ready for her escape. With Oliver's help, his natural charm convincing nurses and evading security cameras, she left the room for the first time in weeks. She wore a hoodie and a coat that barely concealed her fragility, but something in her determined gaze transformed that frail figure into a woman on a mission. The sensation of freedom was bittersweet, marked by both adrenaline and fear. Oliver led her with quick steps, like protagonists in a spy film. "Are you sure about this?" he whispered as he pressed the elevator button. Charlotte nodded. Of course, she was afraid, but fear had been a constant lately. It wouldn't stop her now. They passed through empty corridors, side exits, until they finally felt the fresh night air. Charlotte took a deep breath, as if that simple act symbolized something greater. She was out. She was free. The first stop was a modest apartment, rented by Oliver to ensure she had a safe place to hide. The space was small, but to Charlotte, it felt like a sanctuary. Oliver had thought of everything: clothes, food, even a small canvas and paints in case she wanted to create. "You need something to occupy your mind," he said, adjusting a chair for her. Charlotte didn't respond, but the gratitude was written all over her face. The nights in that apartment were a mix of relief and agony. Charlotte felt protected but couldn't shake the thought of what was happening outside. Jake and Naomi believed she was still in the hospital, defenseless. That was her advantage. "They won't stop," she said to Oliver one evening as he sketched a scene that looked like a field of sunflowers. "I have to act before they find out." Charlotte's physical fragility was a constant reminder of how critical time was. Every movement was a battle against pain but also a small victory over it. Oliver helped with everything, from exercises to strengthen her muscles to strategizing what she called the big plan. Charlotte knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. She needed to return to the battlefield, to her gallery, where it had all begun. One night, as they reviewed documents Oliver had managed to retrieve from the hospital, Charlotte came across a contract she didn't recognize. It was proof that Jake was transferring assets into his own name, taking advantage of her absence. The discovery enraged her. "They're dismantling my life, piece by piece," she said, her voice trembling. Oliver looked at her seriously. "Then it's time to start taking it back, piece by piece?" Charlotte began sketching out a more concrete plan. She needed allies, people who truly believed in her and what her gallery represented. But first, she needed to return. "I need to see with my own eyes what's happening there," she said firmly. Oliver hesitated but knew there was no changing her mind. "Then let's plan this properly," he replied, pulling out a map of the city. Returning to the gallery would be risky, but Charlotte had no choice. Every step she took toward physical recovery was also a step toward reclaiming her life. She felt stronger, not just in body but in mind. Fear still lingered, but it now shared space with something greater, the will to fight. Deep down, she knew this battle wasn't just about her gallery or her fortune, it was about who she was and who she wanted to become. As the days passed, Charlotte prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Jake and Naomi thought they had won, but they underestimated the woman they had betrayed. That would be their mistake. It was only a matter of time before Charlotte re-entered her world, not as a victim, but as someone ready to reclaim what was hers. On that cold, cloudy morning, Charlotte's heart raced as she discreetly crossed the threshold of the Aurora Mason Gallery. The space that had once reflected her soul now felt like a stage for intrigue. The walls were different, some pieces replaced, and the energy of the place was almost unrecognizable. Jake and Naomi had turned the gallery into a facade for their own interests, and the abandonment of its original purpose was evident. Charlotte stayed hidden in the shadows, watching from a distance what remained of her legacy. With Oliver's help, she gathered documents proving that Jake was auctioning off her art pieces in secret. But she knew she needed more than paperwork. It was time to rally allies who truly cared about the gallery. That's when she reached out to Irene Carter, a veteran restorer who had always been suspicious of Jake's intentions. "I knew he was no good," Irene said with a conviction that reignited something in Charlotte. "You tell me what you need and I'll do it." While Irene combed through restoration records and verified falsified pieces, Charlotte approached Greg Kim, the security guard unjustly fired by Jake months earlier. Greg was resentful, but as Charlotte shared her story, his expression softened. "I always suspected something was off. If you're willing to fight, so am I." With these two by her side, Charlotte began to feel that, despite everything, there was still a chance. The challenges, however, came at every turn. At one auction, Charlotte, disguised among the guests, was nearly recognized by Naomi. Her heart raced as she listened to Jake give a speech about the new era of the gallery while selling pieces that were the heart of the collection. She had to leave before anyone noticed her, but the rage burning in her chest was almost unbearable. This was her gallery, her life, and they were destroying it all. Jake, meanwhile, continued to be manipulative and ruthless. He used his influence to discredit Charlotte, insinuating to colleagues in the art world that she was mentally unstable. "She's always been erratic," he told an acquaintance at a cafe, unaware that Irene was recording him. That recording would become a key piece in the puzzle Charlotte was assembling. Each bit of evidence was a brick in the foundation of her strategy. Naomi, on the other hand, seemed more dangerous than ever. If Jake was calculating, Naomi was merciless. Charlotte saw her confront a young artist, forcing him to accept unfair terms to exhibit at the gallery. It was clear she had no scruples. This behavior only fueled Charlotte's resolve. She didn't just want to reclaim the gallery, she wanted to ensure no one else would be harmed by these people. Each day, Charlotte grew stronger. Irene brought documents proving Jake's involvement in fraud, while Greg helped monitor suspicious activities inside the gallery. Oliver, always by her side, became her anchor, reminding her that even amid chaos, there was still beauty and hope. Charlotte felt she was starting to regain something she had lost, her inner strength. But she knew the battle was far from over. Every victory felt small compared to the magnitude of the fight she faced. Jake and Naomi always seemed one step ahead, and with each passing day, the losses mounted. Charlotte needed a decisive blow, something that would completely destabilize them. And deep in her heart, she prepared for the moment when she would have to face them head-on. The days that followed were intense, a careful dance between strategy and improvisation. Charlotte knew that reclaiming her life would require more than determination. She needed irrefutable evidence, loyal allies, and, above all, the courage to confront her greatest fears. Jake and Naomi hadn't just stolen her gallery, they had tried to steal her identity, her purpose. But Charlotte was determined to prove they had underestimated the wrong person. With Irene's help, Charlotte began piecing together a puzzle as treacherous as the two conspirators. Irene uncovered records of suspicious transactions and artworks sold for exorbitant prices, with the money vanishing into offshore accounts. "Jake is clever, but he left a trail," Irene said, showing her the documents. Charlotte felt a mix of relief and indignation. Jake wasn't invincible after all. At the same time, Charlotte hired a lawyer specializing in art and inheritance. Andrew DeWitt, a soft-spoken man with a fierce courtroom reputation, brought the strategic clarity Charlotte desperately needed. He explained the steps required to prosecute Jake and Naomi but warned her that it would be a long and public battle. Charlotte hesitated for a moment. The thought of exposing her life in a courtroom was terrifying, but it was also the only way to achieve justice. As the evidence piled up, Charlotte began transforming the gallery, even from a distance. She and Oliver created a support network for young and marginalized artists, offering them space and resources to grow. This move not only undermined Jake's narrative that the gallery was declining, but it also reignited Charlotte's sense of purpose. The Aurora Mason Gallery was returning to its roots, a place of authenticity and collaboration. The gallery's transformation symbolized something deeper within Charlotte. Every new alliance, every piece of evidence, was a small victory against the abandonment and betrayal that had nearly destroyed her. Greg, now reinstated as head of security, restored a sense of stability. He closely monitored Jake and Naomi's activities, ensuring no critical pieces were lost. Charlotte began to see that she was no longer alone in this fight. But the toughest challenge was yet to come. While gathering evidence, they discovered a critical document. Jake had forged Charlotte's signature on a contract transferring ownership of the gallery to himself. Legally, this meant he was already the owner. The revelation was devastating. "This doesn't change anything," Andrew said firmly. "Fraud is still on our side. But we need more." Charlotte knew the situation was reaching a breaking point. One evening, as the oppressive silence of the night settled in, Charlotte and Oliver talked about the future. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "I don't know if I'm ready," Charlotte admitted. "But I know I don't have a choice." Oliver held her hand for a moment, and in that simple gesture, Charlotte found strength. The fear was still there, but now it was accompanied by an unshakable determination. The final plan was taking shape. Charlotte knew she would have to face Jake and Naomi directly, an idea that left her uneasy. But she also understood that to win, she needed to dive into the depths of what they had created. It was like stepping into a dark cave, not knowing what she would find on the other side. And yet, Charlotte was ready to take the next step. The confrontation took place in a brightly lit room, heavy with the tension of a storm about to break. Jake sat at the table, as confident as ever, his smirk tinged with that air of superiority Charlotte knew so well. Beside him, Naomi, flawless as always, her posture almost defiant. Charlotte walked in with steady steps, feeling the weight of every gaze. They hadn't expected to see her like this. They hadn't expected her to have the audacity to face them head-on. Andrew DeWitt began presenting the evidence, documents exposing the fraud, forged contracts, and illegal transfers. Each word was a blade, slicing through Jake and Naomi's facade. Charlotte watched as the lawyer unraveled their scheme. She remained silent, but her presence spoke volumes. Finally, she was in control, even though the battle was far from over. Fear still lingered, but now it was Jake who seemed uneasy. Naomi was the first to try to destabilize Charlotte. "You've always been so unstable, Charlotte," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "It's no surprise you're trying to blame others." But Charlotte, prepared for this moment, responded with a calmness that even surprised herself. "Unstable enough to build all this on my own? Or just enough to trust the wrong people?" Her voice didn't waver. She wasn't going to let their provocations bring her down. As the lawyer continued presenting evidence, including the recording of Jake disparaging Charlotte, the tension in the room escalated. Jake, always the master manipulator, began losing control. "This is absurd. Charlotte is desperate, trying to save something that's no longer hers," he shouted, his mask of confidence beginning to crack. It was then that Charlotte realized he wasn't as powerful as she had once thought. He was vulnerable. The emotional struggle for Charlotte was as intense as the confrontation itself. Reliving every moment of betrayal, hearing Jake and Naomi's lies repeated, was a test of endurance she never imagined she'd face. But amidst it all, she remembered what Oliver had told her, "You're stronger than you think." And she was. Charlotte stood firm, even as the memories threatened to overwhelm her. She was no longer the woman who had fallen down the stairs. She was someone new. The climax came when Andrew presented the document Jake had forged, with Charlotte's falsified signature. Naomi, who had seemed unshakable until then, finally cracked. "This isn't what it looks like," she exclaimed, but it was too late. The silence in the room was broken only by the sound of Jake muttering under his breath, trying to contain his anger. Charlotte realized this was the end of the line for them. And she had won. The court ruled there was enough evidence to convict Jake and Naomi of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Charlotte felt an overwhelming sense of relief as she heard the verdict, but she didn't celebrate. There was no joy in seeing people who had once been so close to her exposed. There was only the sense of justice. And with it, the certainty that the nightmare was finally coming to an end. As Jake and Naomi were taken away, Charlotte remained silent, watching. She didn't say a word, but she didn't need to. Her victory was evident in every gesture, every glance. It was the beginning of a new chapter, but she knew the work was far from over. The weight of justice had been lifted from her shoulders, but rebuilding her life would be an entirely new challenge. And she was ready for it. When Charlotte finally stepped out of the courthouse that day, the world felt different. It wasn't just the fresh air surrounding her, but the lightness that came with the sense of justice. For the first time in months, she breathed without the crushing weight of fear and betrayal. Jake and Naomi were out of the picture, their masks of power and confidence torn apart by the trial. But for Charlotte, this wasn't just a victory over them. It was a triumph over herself, over everything they had tried to strip away from her. Back at the gallery, Charlotte was greeted by tentative applause from her team. Irene was there, her eyes shining with pride, while Greg maintained his firm posture but allowed a discreet smile to play on his lips. Oliver, of course, stood by her side, offering that look that silently assured her everything would be all right. The Aurora Mason Gallery was no longer just a physical space. Now, it was a symbol of resilience, of how she had turned both a literal and figurative fall into a new beginning. Every corner of the gallery held memories, some painful, others comforting. The walls that had once witnessed her vulnerability now housed a rebirth. Charlotte decided her first step would be to erase any trace of Jake and Naomi. Paintings they had brought under false pretenses were removed, contracts were re-evaluated, and a new exhibition was planned, focused on young and promising artists. "They tried to take this from me," she told Irene. "Now I'll show them that nothing can be taken from someone who truly fights." The deeper impact, however, lay in the small victories Charlotte celebrated in silence. Sitting in the gallery with Oliver and Irene, discussing the new directions they would take. Watching artists walk in with renewed enthusiasm, knowing the space was now a true refuge. Every detail, from the wall colors to the invitations for the exhibition, was an affirmation that Charlotte had regained control. And more than that, she had regained herself. Still, the rewards were not just material or professional, they were emotional. It was feeling that the abandonment she had endured no longer defined her. In Irene, Greg, and Oliver's support, Charlotte found something she never expected, a sense of belonging that extended beyond her gallery. They weren't there out of convenience, but by choice. Out of loyalty. And that meant more than any courtroom victory. One quiet evening, as she walked through the empty gallery, Charlotte stopped in front of one of the new pieces that had arrived. It was Oliver's. A vibrant canvas, full of movement and light, yet tinged with a melancholy that seemed to reflect part of their journey. She smiled, a genuine smile, as a wave of gratitude washed over her. "You saved this," she whispered to herself. "And I saved you too." The future was still uncertain, but Charlotte knew she was ready to face it. It was no longer about rebuilding what had been lost, but about creating something entirely new. The Aurora Mason Gallery would not just be a space for art, it would be a space for stories, for fresh starts, for people who, like her, had fallen and found the strength to rise again. And in that moment, she knew it would all be worth it. The rebirth of the Aurora Mason Gallery didn't happen in a single event but through a series of small moments that, together, formed something extraordinary. Now at peace with what she had faced, Charlotte devoted herself entirely to transforming her gallery into a meaningful space. She didn't just want to showcase art, she wanted to create a community, a refuge for artists and anyone seeking a deeper connection with art and themselves. One of her first steps was to reinstate Irene as creative director. Charlotte knew that Irene's experience and vision were essential for the gallery's new phase. "You always saw what I couldn't," Charlotte said as she officially handed over the title. It was more than a promotion, it was a symbol of trust. Greg, in turn, was appointed head of security and logistics advisor. "You kept the gallery safe when no one else did," Charlotte told him, her voice heavy with gratitude. Collaboration with Oliver brought an unexpected freshness to the gallery. Charlotte gave him a dedicated space to work and exhibit his pieces. More than that, Oliver became a partner in both the creative process and her heart. He inspired her in ways that went beyond art, helping her rediscover parts of herself that had long been dormant. Together, they created programs to support young artists, offering mentorships, exhibitions, and even financial aid to those in need. The impact of this transformation was palpable. The gallery was vibrant, brimming with energy and hope. Visitors seemed to sense they were witnessing something more than art. It was Charlotte's resilience, translated into every detail. "I want this place to be a reminder," she said during the opening of the new exhibition, "that art, like life, can teach us to transform pain into beauty." But the journey wasn't just about the gallery, it was also about Charlotte reconnecting with herself. She began traveling again, seeking new inspirations and learning from curators around the world. Each trip was an opportunity for growth, a chance to leave behind echoes of the past and embrace the present. And with each step, Charlotte felt more whole, more empowered. The bonds she had formed during her journey also continued to grow stronger. Irene and Greg became pillars in her life, while Oliver occupied a space that was both partnership and love. Charlotte knew these people weren't there just to support her, they also challenged her to be better, to grow, to never settle. It was a dynamic she never imagined finding but now cherished deeply. Charlotte's world was different now, but she knew that was exactly how it needed to be. Every detail, every change, was a reflection of who she had become. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened, it was about using it as a foundation for something stronger, something truer. She had faced chaos and abandonment, but now she was at peace with whatever the future held. As night fell over New York, Charlotte walked through the illuminated gallery, the walls adorned with works that told stories of transformation and hope. She stopped in the center of the main hall, breathing deeply. This was her legacy, her home. And for the first time in a long while, Charlotte felt she was exactly where she was meant to be. Charlotte's triumphant return to the art world was more than a recovery, it was a reinvention. The Aurora Mason Gallery became a place of stories, rebirths, and possibilities. It was no longer just about collecting and displaying art, it was about the transformative power of creativity. Charlotte had turned her pain into purpose, creating a space where others could find inspiration and healing, just as she had. Her legacy extended far beyond the gallery walls. Charlotte began giving lectures and hosting events, sharing her journey with other artists and entrepreneurs. Every story she told carried a message: never underestimate your ability to start over, even when everything seems lost. Audiences connected with her viscerally, seeing in her a woman who not only overcame adversity but used it as fuel to create something greater. The programs for young artists started gaining national attention. One initiative, created in partnership with Oliver, offered artist residencies for those from marginalized communities. "It's not just about art," Oliver said at an event. "It's about creating a space where people can dream again." Hearing this, Charlotte realized she was building something far bigger than herself. It was a movement, a celebration of resilience. On a personal level, Charlotte and Oliver's relationship flourished. He was her anchor but also a force propelling her forward. Together, they began planning not just exhibitions but a new life. Now a recognized artist, Oliver found in his partnership with Charlotte the perfect balance of love and creativity. "You didn't save me," she said one evening as they looked out over the city from a window. "You reminded me how to save myself." The revitalized gallery became a beacon of hope. Artists from around the world sent in their work, hoping to be part of the space Charlotte had transformed. She carefully selected each piece, searching for stories that echoed her own journey. In one particularly moving exhibition, she featured an installation that symbolized both a fall and a rise, a silent narration of her story. The audience stood in reverent silence before it, understanding that it was more than art, it was the essence of a life rebuilt. Charlotte knew, however, that her mission didn't end there. Inspired by everything she had experienced, she began writing a book about her journey. It wasn't just about the traumas she endured but the lessons she learned along the way. Each chapter was a tribute to those who helped her, the battles she fought, and the small victories that ultimately brought her to where she was. The book, titled Aurora, Rising from the Shadows, became an instant success, touching the lives of people who had never even heard of her before. As the years passed, the Aurora Mason Gallery continued to grow, but Charlotte remained true to her roots. She knew the true triumph wasn't the victory over Jake and Naomi or the gallery's rebirth. It was the strength she found within herself, the courage to face her fears, and the ability to transform abandonment into a new chance to live fully. Now, that strength was accessible to everyone who walked through her gallery's doors. On a gala evening, as guests mingled throughout the gallery, Charlotte observed from a distance, a glass of wine in hand. Irene and Greg chatted with young artists. Oliver showcased his new works. Charlotte closed her eyes for a moment, letting a wave of peace wash over her. This wasn't just the end of a journey, it was the beginning of a legacy that would continue to inspire and transform. She had returned. And, more importantly, she had found herself.